ahead in there.
Make yourself comfortable, pal.
When it became clear that his story was not matching with the evidence that we had, he says, all right, I did it.
I did it.
Let's see right in there.
It's really unclear how much she knows at that point.
She was a young girl who had a lot to go for in her life and got hooked up with the wrong guy.
They were in adjacent rooms and he was screaming, I love you to her.
I know you can hear me. You never stop loving me. It's so funny.
It was a toxic relationship.
They're an ordinary couple just ring shopping while he's lying dead in the garage.
Love can make people do a lot of crazy things. Love can make people do anything they put their mind to.
Just 90 minutes from New York City, Asbury Park, New Jersey is a beachside community nestled in the heart of the Jersey Shore.
Asbury Park is a shore town. It gets exceptionally busy in the summertime, family friendly. There's a big boardwalk. It attracts a lot of people looking for a good time.
You don't see as much violent crime, but it still exists.
On February 9th, 2017, a young woman, Tracy, walked into the Asbury Park Police Department and reported her boyfriend, Trubal Patel, to be missing. She had last heard from Trubal Patel on February 6th of 2017.
Tracy had said that they had spent the morning together and she knew that he was going to Asbury Park. She didn't know why, but they had had some plans to get together for a celebration for his birthday, and she had been calling him. He hadn't been responding.
Tracy was incredibly concerned for Trubal. She believed that something had happened to him.
Authorities asked Tracy for more information about Trubal and learned that the 28-year-old was born in India.
They were a loving family. They had means. They weren't poor by any stretch of the imagination. They, at some point, moved to New Jersey to live their life. They were running their own convenience store.
Trubal came into his own and developed a great many friendships.
The first time I met Trubal, I was bartending, and he just got off of work one day and somehow ended up at my bar and started talking to him. I knew that he was a forever friend. Trubal wanted to make sure that everyone was happy around him. Trubal was just one of a kind. Man that would give you shirt off his back.
He was known to be very generous with his friends, things like picking up dinner tabs or picking up the tab for drinks.
He paid like the whole bill every time he went out with us. Always tipped well. Money wasn't an issue. There was not a bad bone in that guy's body.
In February of 2015, Trubal met Tracy, and the two instantly clicked.
Trubal and Tracy had dated for several years.
Trubal wanted to spend all of his free time with her. Anytime there was a holiday or a birthday, Tracy was Trubal's go-to person.
Just one day shy of Trubal's 29th birthday, Tracy has enlisted police to help find her boyfriend.
Tracy did not believe that he would just take off and not respond to her calls and, calls and text messages from other friends. She was pretty adamant that something had happened to him.
Tracy tells authorities that Trubal hasn't been to his apartment in 3 days, and his car isn't parked there either.
You're going to give the police department identifiable characteristics of that person. In this case, it was a large Buddha tattoo that Trubal Patel had on his back.
We asked about some things that he would have been wearing at the time. And one of those things was a very nice Movado watch. As I recall, it was a black face with diamonds around it. The car that Trupal Patel drove was rather unique in that it was a 2003 black Jaguar with a standard shift transmission.
The police compile a flyer that's distributed to law enforcement. Local jails and hospitals would also be checked.
Posters are going up, comments are being made on social media. The word is out that Trupal is missing, and he is nowhere in sight. There is not a sign of Trupal anywhere.
2 hours later, a local tow truck driver contacts police.
AAA notified the Asbury Park Police Department because they found Trupal Patel's car.
Trupal's car was found in Asbury Park.
It was unoccupied and had been parked on the side of the road.
The driver explains he was hired by someone claiming to be locked out of the Jaguar.
AAA notified the Asbury Park Police Department because they realized that they weren't the actual owner of the vehicle.
When investigators arrive, they are greeted by the tow truck driver and are stunned to see who made the call to the tow truck company. Trupal's girlfriend, Tracy.
Tracy and Trupal's friends conducted their own investigation into Trupal being missing. They distributed missing persons flyers throughout the Asbury Park area. Tracy and Trupal's friends locate Trupal's car parked outside of an auto body shop on Langford Street in Asbury Park.
Once they found Trupal Patel's car, they tried to gain access to it by calling AAA.
They were concerned that he might have been in the trunk.
Authorities decide to act on Tracy's concerns.
There was entry made into the car to see if Trupal happened to be in the trunk. He was not.
There were no signs of any sort of struggle. It didn't look as though the car had been broken into or that there was any signs of foul play.
When investigators press Tracy for more information about Trupal's plans in Asbury Park 3 days earlier, she admits she's been withholding one major piece of information.
Trupal Patel was a marijuana dealer. He dealt in larger quantities of marijuana.
Tracy knew that he was selling drugs and just didn't want to tell the police because they felt that it would sway or kind of prejudice us against Trupal and the possibility that he was a legitimate victim.
Police wanted to know if there was a connection between Trupal's drug dealing and Trupal's disappearance.
He could have developed an enemy from selling marijuana.
Coming up, the discovery of a body shifts the investigation into high gear.
It was quite obvious that there was a human wrapped up in that blanket.
He had been a victim of gunshot wounds.
And a sordid romance takes shape as authorities search for a killer.
Anybody who knew them knew that they had a pretty toxic, sometimes volatile relationship.
Hours after 28-year-old Trupal Patel was reported missing, authorities in Asbury Park, New Jersey have just learned from his girlfriend Tracy that Trupal had been selling marijuana at a local apartment complex the day he disappeared.
On February 6th, the last place Trupal Patel had gone was to Monroe Towers, an apartment building in Asbury Park, to meet with a friend, and he was there to sell her marijuana.
Investigators head for Monroe Towers in order to retrace Trupal's steps.
There were 3 people that Trupal Patel had seen at the Monroe Towers. They were narcotic sales. And we spoke with all of those people, including the manager, who said that he, came, they spoke with him, and that he had left of his own free will.
Surveillance footage shows Trupal Patel leaving the building at about 3:30 on February 6th. He does not look to be in distress. He looks very calm. He is, just a regular guy walking to his car in the parking lot.
Investigators collect the surveillance footage as evidence and return to the station to dig further into Trupal's background. That's when they discover a recent arrest that might provide more clarity on his disappearance.
We learned that prior to Trupal Patel's disappearance, he had recently been arrested.
In 2016, Ocean County had made an arrest of Trupal. He had 4 pounds of marijuana and mushrooms, and he spent a few months in jail. Eventually, Trupal had been released on bail, but he had a court case pending.
They were thinking that he had some pending drug charges and maybe he left town so he didn't have to face those charges.
It kind of lent more towards what may have happened to him, at least a reason as to why he went missing. Quite some time passed. There were no further leads in his missing person case, either through the Asbury Park Police Department or through Tracy and her friends conducting their own canvass of the area.
It just didn't make sense. Like, he wasn't someone who was gonna go away. Like, it wasn't like he was gonna suddenly take a downward spiral. It wasn't anything like that.
On February 22nd, 13 days after the initial missing persons report, police receive a disheartening call.
My office was notified that there was a body found in the Shark River Park. This is approximately 3 miles from Asbury Park along Gully Road in the township of Wall. I immediately head over to the area where the body was located.
And it was down an embankment, almost as if somebody had tossed him and he had rolled down the hill and he had been hidden from view.
This is a rural stretch of road. There's forest on both sides, and it's very dark at night. And the way that the landscape is there, the road is at a level, and then there's a ravine that kind of drops off.
A park ranger had been picking up trash in the area, happened to get further into that area of the park and was able to discover the body.
It was quite obvious that there was a human wrapped up in that blanket. You could see his skin, part of his head was sticking out. I believe you could see his shoes.
His body was actually in very good condition. It was the winter time, it had been very cold, and it appeared that he had been a victim of gunshot wounds. Detectives were able to make the identification pretty quickly due to a tattoo, a Buddha tattoo that was on his back.
We were able to match that particular tattoo to Trupal Patel. So we immediately initiate a homicide investigation.
Detectives essentially now have to work backwards and figure out how Trupal Patel came to be deceased in Shark River Park. They had to go back to the beginning and try to figure out, who potential suspects even were at that point.
Nearly 2 weeks after 28-year-old Trupal Patel was first reported missing, Asbury Park police have discovered his bullet-riddled body in a residential park.
Detectives at the scene observed gunshot wounds to Trupal's body, and they did not observe any blood in the area. It appeared that his body had been dumped there and he had been pushed down the embankment from the roadway.
We turned the body over to a medical examiner for a closer examination to determine manner and cause of death. After we identified Trupal Patel, we immediately contacted some of the investigators that were involved with his arrest. finding out who he might have been involved with. Did he ever turn state's evidence against anyone in order for a special deal on his charges, things of that nature. Those would have been all reasons that somebody would have wanted Trupel dead, right? But we did not find anything.
When authorities break the news of Trupel's death to his parents, they struggle to process the heartbreaking reality.
They were devastated. I think as any parent would be, they were overcome with grief.
Trupel's family was just, upset to be in this situation, and they really wanted justice for their son.
Trupel's parents can't think of anyone who would want to hurt their son. Trupel's friends share the same sentiment.
Detectives took a number of statements from various friends of Trupel to try to ascertain who might dislike Trupel or have a grudge against him or have any reason to want to kill him.
When they found his body in Shark River, I was just like, who could have done this? Why would someone kill Trupel? Trupel's such a nice guy. He was friends with everyone. How did anyone hurt him?
Everyone had great things to say about him. He was friendly, he was generous, he was never intimidating, he was never threatening. So it came as a shock to people when they learned that he was dead.
He could be described as sort of your friendly neighborhood marijuana dealer, and he predominantly sold marijuana to suburban middle-class individuals.
If someone took from him, he'd be like, okay, well, I'm not going to sell to them again. That was it. It didn't matter to him. He didn't need revenge.
There was, no one that really wanted him deceased in terms of enemies.
The following day, an autopsy report offers investigators further insight into Trupel's murder.
They learned that the cause of death is gunshot wounds, 2 to the head, 1 to the chest.
The medical examiner determined that Trupel Patel was killed with a .22 caliber rifle. Specifically, the murder weapon was identified as a Marlin long rifle.
When investigators compare the autopsy findings to details from Trupel's missing persons report, one item in particular stands out.
Trupel was known to wear a very fancy, very flashy Movado watch, and that watch was not found on his body.
The next thing police are asking themselves is, was this a robbery gone bad? Was Trupel simply a target because of his bling?
Detectives were definitely considering whether robbery was a motive. The missing watch is definitely a lead. You can go to different pawn shops in the area and see if the watch was sold.
Investigators don't get any hits, so they appeal to the public.
At this point, there's no leads, so they turn to the media for help.
They posted information about Trupel as well as his vehicle, a picture of the vehicle. They posted that online and sent it out to news agencies and asked anybody with information to contact the prosecutor's office. And that led to Tyler Uhas coming forward.
My name is Tyler Uhas. I lived in Neptune at the time, and that's pretty much, the next town over.
Tyler Uhas sees the picture of the Jaguar in the news, and he recognizes that Jaguar, and he becomes concerned about his involvement with that Jaguar.
I moved the vehicle onto Asbury Avenue in Asbury Park, and at that point, I went forward to the prosecutor's office and told them everything I knew.
Tyler Uhas has just arrived at the Monmouth County Prosecutor's Office, alleging he has information about a black Jaguar belonging to murder victim Trupel Patel.
Tyler gives a statement to detectives where he says that he moved the car at the behest of Joseph Villani.
I used to be friends with Joey back in 2016, I believe. We became friends. Joey was always in the same parties and same areas I was in, so that's how we became friends.
Joey Villani had 2 older brothers. He lived in Ocean Township with his father. His mother lived in Maryland.
Tyler tells investigators that on the morning of February 8th, 2017, Joey had called him with a favor.
So Joey calls me one day on FaceTime and says to me, "Hey bro, I need you to move my uncle's car to the shop so it can get brakes done." And I'm like, "Well, why can't you move it yourself?"
He needed Tyler's help driving it because Joey could not drive a stick shift car, and the vehicle had to be moved to an auto body shop in Asbury Park.
He says, "Can we just drive it over there tomorrow? I got an appointment." And that's when I said, "Okay, whatever, no big deal, I guess." That next day, he calls me and picks me up from my house. We're on our way to his house. Once we get to his house, I get in the car. So from there, I drive the car to the shop. And as I was parking the car, I saw Joey parking on the adjacent side of the road. I take the keys out of the ignition, I get out of the car, and I go to run inside the shop. They hand him the keys, and he yells, they got one, just get in the car and let's go. So I got in the car, and we left. In between that time of us leaving and him going to drop me off, I'm like, this just doesn't sound right. None of this sounds right. Like, I just screwed up big time. I just did something wrong.
Tyler says his suspicions were confirmed 2 weeks later.
It's the article about that car. And the picture of the vehicle was of that Jaguar. And that's how I put 2 and 2 together, and right from there I went forward to the prosecutor's office.
Tyler informs investigators that Joey Villani spends most of his time with his girlfriend, Raquel Garajau.
He said Joseph Villani and Raquel Garajau started dating approximately 1 year or more prior to this occurring.
Raquel was, your typical 19-year-old college student. She was smart. She was very vivacious.
She lived with her mother and her older sister. She was attending Brookdale Community College to get her associate's degree. She worked part-time at a law office for an attorney.
Raquel, I met through Joey. She was just a regular girl. I mean, she liked her material things. She loved her makeup. Having hair, nails done.
She met Joey Villani towards the end of her high school career.
I remember we were at a party one night, and Joey just runs into her, and then he starts talking to her, and he ends up inviting her back to the house, and ever since then, they were just a couple.
According to Tyler, the relationship between Raquel and Joey had its share of ups and downs.
They would always be happy when they were together and they were doing their own thing, and then, obviously one little thing would happen and there would be, a huge fight. And then 2-3 seconds later, they would become, A-okay again, and I love you this, I love you that.
Anybody who knew them knew that they had a pretty toxic, sometimes volatile relationship.
Joey and Raquel, they like to have a good time. They'd use drugs, in particular marijuana, and they also dealt in smaller quantities of marijuana amongst their friend circle and other kids that they knew in the area.
Tyler suggests that Joey had developed a sense of competition with Trupal Patel when it came to selling marijuana.
I know Joey used to always say how he wanted to meet Trupal. He would jokingly say that he wanted to meet him so he could rob him. Joey's friend used to pick up off of Trupal a lot. I believe that's how Joey met Trupel.
Tyler swears that he had no idea he was driving Trupel Patel's car when he helped Joey on February 8th.
The next investigative step would be to really verify Tyler's story.
Detectives asked Tyler if he would agree to make phone calls to Joey Villani that would be recorded by police to see what Joey would say about moving Trupel's car.
I was beyond nervous. All you're thinking about is, am I going to get in trouble for something? Is this it? You know, what the hell? Like, why me?
Two days after Monmouth County authorities discovered Trupel Patel murdered, Tyler Uhas has just claimed that his friend, 20-year-old Joey Villani, had asked him to move Trupel's car 2 weeks earlier.
Tyler was adamant that he had no information about the homicide of Trupel Patel, that he just moved the car for Joey.
So they asked me to call Joey on the phone on speaker and blatantly straight up tell him that I have the cops at my door about Trupel's car and I need help.
Hello?
Yo, dude, yeah. Bro, the cops are at my house, bro.
You're lying, bro. You're lying.
No, I'm not lying.
All right, so let's just say, if the cops ask you, did you drive a black or a Jaguar, whatever they say, all right?
Okay.
You say no. You just say no. You say no, bro. Just deny, bro. Deny.
Okay. Okay.
It was clear to law enforcement officers based on the conversation that Joe Villani knew all about the victim's car because he was coaching Tyler Uhas and how to handle the police.
So detectives tell Tyler to set up a meeting with Joey.
All right, meet me at the Monmouth Mall, bro, in front of the movie theater. Get there right now, please.
All right.
All right, go. I'm on my way there.
When Joey arrives, his girlfriend Raquel Garajau is with him.
On February 24th, Joey and Raquel head to the Monmouth Mall, thinking they're meeting up with Tyler Uhas, and instead, Monmouth County detectives are there waiting for them.
Investigators bring both Joey and Raquel back to the Monmouth County Prosecutor's Office for questioning.
Go ahead in there.
Make yourself comfortable, pal.
Joey is in one interview room and Raquel is in another. Investigators speak to them separately.
Before Joey's interview officially begins, investigators collect an important piece of evidence from him.
What he had been wearing at the time was a Movado watch. So he did remove the watch and it was placed into an evidence bag. We immediately start reaching out to Tracy, can you please get us a picture of Trupel Patel wearing the watch?
While investigators wait for a response from Trupel's girlfriend, they begin questioning Joey about his relationship to the victim.
Have you ever met Troop before?
No.
Maybe you're at parties together?
Are mutual? I met him, I did meet him once, but
Okay.
That's it.
About an hour into their interview with Joey, investigators get the proof they need from Trupel's girlfriend, Tracy.
During his interview, I brought out the picture of Trupel Patel wearing the watch.
I noticed that you have a nice watch in your possession there. That's also a very similar, almost, I guess, the same watch that's on Troop.
Could be.
It could be.
Joey continues to stonewall investigators. In the room next door, investigators immediately confront Raquel about Trupel Patel's murder.
What knowledge do you have about Trupel's murder?
Nothing.
About how he was killed?
Nothing. I just know that it was a murder. He got shot in the head from the Asbury Park thing.
Shot in the head from what Asbury Park thing?
Or it was... yeah, shot. I read it on On Facebook. Yeah.
You said something about a gunshot wound to the head. You want to know something? Nobody knows about that.
Investigators continue to pressure Raquel until she finally admits that Joey had confessed to her.
She ultimately says that Joey killed Trupel in self-defense and that it happened in Joey's garage.
What did Joey tell you about that? How did he tell you he killed him?
Sorry.
Whose gun did he use to shoot him?
Assistance.
At that point, we were unsure as to her level of involvement. Did she just know about it? Was she involved before, during, after?
Just need you to be truthful. Take a deep breath and tell us what happened.
So Trupel went to Joey's house on Monday. And while I was at work. And they started arguing. I guess it got really physical. Trupel was threatening him. Joey freaked out.
Raquel told detectives that she was at work during the time of the murder.
Did you see his body?
No.
Did you help clean up?
No.
While Joey and Raquel are held in custody, investigators race to the alleged scene of the crime.
The Monmouth County detectives executed a search warrant on the parents' home of Joey Villani.
When they search that residence, they find a .22 caliber Marlin long rifle.
We learned that the murder weapon had been located in the house.
Detectives found shell casings in the garage for a .22 caliber bullet. Detectives were able to collect blood samples from the garage. Those samples were later tested and it was determined to be Trupel Patel's blood.
With physical evidence tying Joey to the crime, investigators now need a confession.
When it became clear that his story was not matching with the evidence that we had, he, at one point in his interview, kind of throws his hands up and says, "All right, I did it."
I did it. I shot Trooper Patel. Raquel had nothing to do with it. I had told her I had done it, but that's it.
Ultimately, he admitted that he was going to rip him off, and there was some type of altercation, and during the course of that, in self-defense, he tried to protect himself and shot and killed Trupel Patel. Joey stated that Raquel Garajau had nothing to do with it.
Investigators tell Raquel that Joey has come clean.
They were in adjacent rooms and he was screaming, "I love you" to her. She was being interviewed next door.
Raquel, I know you can hear me.
You never talk over me. You know what you do what I gotta do. I'm done. You're done. You're big thing. For you.
Joseph Villani was ultimately arrested and charged with the death of Trupel Patel. After questioning Raquel Garajau, she was released and was not charged.
Why don't you come with us?
We didn't have really any other evidence to show that she was involved.
In order to clear Raquel of any wrongdoing, investigators need to corroborate her story.
Before Raquel left the prosecutor's office that night, she had given consent to search her cell phone. It's really unclear how much she knows at that point. So that was one of the first things that we started doing, was going through her cell phone. She had deleted all of her text messages with Joey, and we were able to recover those.
Authorities discover that leading up to Trupel's murder, Raquel had sent Joey an incriminating text.
On January 19th, Joey texted Raquel that the rifle works and that he's got the bullets. A few days later, I think it was on February 2nd, Raquel sends a text message to Joey, "You need to clean the bullets." She was instructing him to wipe the bullets down, thinking he would leave fingerprints on them.
Following Trupel's death, Raquel sent more damning texts to Joey.
She was just telling Joey to kind of like how to deal with it, like clean up, bleach everything. Like it was just very cold. No remorse was found in any of their text messages. In addition to the text messages of the cell phone records, the cell phone location records really build our case against Raquel.
What we did determine using her cell phone, she was in the area of Joey's house. She did not go to work that day.
We realized she was lying about multiple things.
So at that point, a determination was made to go to the grand jury and get an indictment for Raquel.
Monmouth County investigators have discovered evidence that suggests 20-year-old Joey Villani and his girlfriend, 19-year-old Raquel Garajau, had plotted the murder of Trupel Patel together.
On May 15, 2017, so about 3 months after Joey is arrested, Raquel is arrested and charged with the same crime. She's charged with felony murder, armed robbery, conspiracy, and other related offenses. We had Trupel's blood in Joey's garage. We had Trupel's blood in Joey's car. We had the murder weapon in Joey's house. So we had a really strong case against Joey Villani. Not the same with Raquel, though. The case against her was very circumstantial.
On July 17, 2018, the trial of Raquel Garajau begins in Monmouth County, New Jersey.
She was a young girl who had a lot to go for in her life and got hooked up with the wrong guy.
It was a toxic relationship, and Joey wanted to make her happy. And Raquel wanted certain things to be happy. She wanted money, she wanted nice things, and at the time, Joey had $1.31 in his bank account, and Trupel was somebody that they realized that they could target. You know, he wasn't a violent guy. The evidence shows that on February 6th, Trupel Patel left Monroe Towers at about 3:30 and drove to Joey Villani's house in Ocean Township.
Trupel is going to Joey's house to just make another drug sale. He walks into Joey's garage. Joey has a .22 caliber long rifle, like a hunting rifle, and Joey shoots Trupel 3 times, twice in the head, once in the chest.
This was not a self-defense case. The medical examiner concluded that Trupel Patel was not shot at close range. He was shot from further away.
Cell phone records show Raquel in close proximity, going back to Joey's house shortly after.
And Raquel searches how to drive a stick shift at 4:23 p.m., which is probably only, minutes after Trupel is murdered. So we believed that when he realized the car was a stick shift, they had to go to Plan B at that point and reach out to Tyler.
Prosecutors argue the couple took Trupel's money and went shopping.
Trupel Patel made a lot of money selling marijuana. He was also known to carry large amounts of cash on his person.
We believe Joey takes all of Trupel's marijuana, his cash, his Movado watch. We put the ballpark of the cash around maybe $2,000.
They go to the mall, to Pandora, and Joey buys Raquel a promise ring that she's been asking him for in cash for $400.
They're buying Raquel a ring. They're an ordinary couple just ring shopping while Trupel's lying dead in the garage.
We believe that Trupel's body was in Joey Villani's garage from about the time of the homicide, which we put at about 4 o'clock on February 6th, until sometime later that night into the early hours of the following morning.
The defense asserts Raquel's only offense was falling for Joey Villani.
There was no physical evidence, no statements from anyone connecting Raquel Garajau to Patel's death. And as a matter of fact, her co-defendant now, Joseph Villani, had indicated Raquel Garajau had nothing to do with the death of Trupel Patel. Make sure you clean the bullets was the text that was most problematic in the case because it occurred 3 days before the death of Trupel Patel.
After a 10-week trial, jury deliberations get underway on September 12, 2018.
The jury ultimately found Raquel guilty on all of the counts against her.
Ultimately, in January of 2019, she is sentenced to 33 years with a mandatory period of 30 years before she's eligible for parole.
After Raquel was convicted, Joey pleads guilty to a charge of aggravated manslaughter and desecration of human remains for disposing of Trupel's body, and the judge ultimately sentences him to 40 years in prison. They're where they deserve to be. You know, she probably wouldn't have pulled the trigger herself, but Joey would never have done this without Raquel.
Love can make people do a lot of crazy things. Love can make people do anything that they put their mind to over it.
I want the world to remember Trupel for his heart and for his generosity and the fun person that would just always be there if you needed him. I want him to be remembered for being a great friend in every aspect, and he will be missed.
The road cut through the darkness like a scar across California's Central Valley, silent except for the distant whisper of tires rolling over old pavement and the restless wind that swept across endless rows of almond orchards. On the morning of January 16th, Sill 1980, a routine drive became something no one in Kern County would ever forget. Hidden among weeds beside a lonely stretch of roadway near Interstate 5 lay the body of a young woman. She had no purse, no identification, no witness waiting to explain what had happened. Only silence. The cold winter air carried no answers, and before investigators could even place a name beside her face, another question emerged. Who would leave a victim here, hundreds of miles from where she had last been seen, hoping time itself would erase the truth? For decades, that lonely roadside would become the final chapter of a mystery that refused to disappear, a case that haunted detectives, devastated a family, and quietly waited for science to catch up with a killer who believed he had committed the perfect crime. The woman was 28-year-old Barbara Tucker. Friends described her as kind, independent, and determined to build a life on her own terms. She was living in San Diego County, balancing everyday responsibilities like countless other Californians at the end of the 1970s. It was an era when the state seemed caught between glamour and uncertainty. Southern California promised opportunity, yet violent crime had become an unsettling reality. Headlines about serial predators, disappearances, and unsolved murders appeared with disturbing regularity. Families locked their doors earlier. Women learned to be cautious in parking lots and on lonely highways. Even then, few could imagine how easily someone could simply vanish. Barbara disappeared during the final days of 1979. At first, there was hope that she had merely left unexpectedly or was visiting friends without notifying anyone. Hours became days. Days became weeks. Concern hardened into fear. Loved ones searched for explanations, replaying conversations, examining calendars, wondering whether they had missed some warning sign. Every ringing telephone brought both hope and dread. Every knock at the door carried the possibility of devastating news. Instead, there was only uncertainty, the cruelest companion any family can know. When authorities finally identified the woman discovered in Kern County, the confirmation shattered those who had refused to surrender hope. Barbara had not simply disappeared. She had been murdered. The details revealed a brutal reality. Investigators determined that she had suffered a violent attack before her body was abandoned far from the place where she had lived. Whoever killed her had made deliberate choices. The distance alone suggested planning. Transporting a victim across California required time, confidence, and an understanding that every passing mile complicated the investigation. The killer had not simply fled the scene. He had attempted to bury the crime beneath geography itself. Crime scene investigators worked carefully despite the limitations of forensic science in 1980. Every strand of hair, every fiber, every fingerprint, every trace of biological evidence was collected with painstaking attention. Detectives photographed the surrounding landscape, measured tire tracks where possible, examined vegetation disturbed by the body's placement, and searched the roadside for discarded objects that might connect victim and killer. The scene yielded clues, but not enough to point toward a suspect. The evidence was preserved, cataloged, and sealed away. No one could know that some of those tiny samples would become priceless decades later. Barbara's death quickly became another homicide file, competing for attention in an already overburdened criminal justice system. Detectives interviewed relatives, friends, neighbors, and co-workers. They reconstructed her final known movements as carefully as memory allowed. Every person who had spoken with her during those final days became part of an expanding investigative web. Hundreds of questions filled notebooks. Did she mention meeting anyone? Had she argued with someone? Was she afraid? Had anyone noticed unusual vehicles near her residence? Had strangers been watching her routine? Every answer seemed to produce 3 new questions. The difficulty was immediate. Modern surveillance cameras did not exist on every street corner. Mobile phones could not reveal locations. Credit card activity was limited. Digital records that investigators rely upon today simply did not exist. Detectives depended on witness memories, handwritten notes, paper receipts, and physical evidence collected by hand. If someone lied, proving it was often nearly impossible. If a witness forgot an important detail, that memory could disappear forever. Still, investigators refused to give up. They examined known offenders operating throughout Southern California. They reviewed reports involving sexual assaults, violent attacks, and disappearances. They considered whether Barbara's murder could be connected to larger criminal patterns. California during the late 70s was experiencing extraordinary levels of violent crime. Multiple serial offenders were active across different regions. Every unsolved homicide raised the possibility of another predator hiding in plain sight. Yet Barbara's case stubbornly resisted explanation. If weeks turned into months, months became years. Eventually, the investigation entered a phase feared by every detective assigned to homicide. Leads slowed. Witnesses moved away. Telephone numbers changed. Memories faded. Some investigators retired. Others transferred. New detectives inherited boxes filled with reports created by people they had never met. Every fresh review began with the same question. What had everyone else missed? Barbara's family lived with an entirely different kind of investigation. Their search never appeared inside official case files. It unfolded during birthdays marked by empty chairs, holiday dinners interrupted by moments of silence, family photographs that stopped growing because one face would never again appear in front of the camera. Grief evolved into endurance. Questions became permanent residents inside every conversation. Who did this? Why Barbara? Would anyone ever be arrested? Years passed. Then another decade. California transformed around the unsolved murder. Cities expanded. Technology accelerated. Highways grew busier. Children born after Barbara disappeared became adults themselves. New detectives entered law enforcement without realizing that somewhere inside climate-controlled evidence rooms sat sealed envelopes connected to a forgotten homicide waiting for the future. Meanwhile, forensic science experienced a revolution. DNA profiling emerged during the mid-1980s and quickly changed criminal investigations across the world. Suddenly, biological evidence once considered useless acquired extraordinary value. Tiny traces invisible to the human eye could identify offenders with remarkable precision. Cases previously dependent upon eyewitness testimony gained powerful scientific support. Investigators across America reopened evidence lockers containing clothing, fingernail scrapings, and preserved biological samples collected decades earlier by detectives who had never imagined such technology would exist. Barbara Tucker's case was among thousands that quietly waited. Testing methods improved year after year. Laboratories became more sophisticated. DNA databases expanded. Convicted offenders entered national systems, allowing investigators to compare biological evidence against known criminals. Families of murder victims watched news reports describing old cases solved after 20 or 30 years and wondered whether their own nightmare might someday end. But Barbara's case remained silent. No database match. No confession. No eyewitness emerging after decades. Nothing. As cold case units gained popularity throughout the United States, experienced investigators began reviewing long-forgotten files with renewed determination. Unlike the detectives who had originally handled these murders, cold case specialists possessed something invaluable. Time itself had become an investigative tool. Relationships changed. Criminals aged. Witnesses reconsidered old loyalties. Scientific techniques improved. Evidence once impossible to analyze could suddenly speak. Barbara's preserved evidence attracted renewed attention because investigators had done something critically important back in 1980. They had carefully stored biological material despite having no technology capable of fully examining it. Their discipline, patience, and adherence to evidence protocols unknowingly preserved the future of the investigation. Every sealed envelope represented possibility. Every preserved sample represented hope. Still, testing alone could not guarantee justice. Investigators submitted evidence for increasingly advanced DNA analysis. Profiles were developed with greater precision than ever before, yet traditional law enforcement databases produced no identification. The unknown male DNA remained exactly that unknown. Somewhere, the individual whose genetic profile had been recovered continued living an ordinary life. He might have married, raised children, worked regular jobs, attended neighborhood gatherings, paid taxes, smiled in family photographs. Perhaps he believed the murder had disappeared forever beneath for decades of silence. Cold case detectives refused to accept that outcome. Across America, a new investigative strategy was quietly reshaping impossible cases. Instead of searching only criminal databases, specially trained investigators began using genetic genealogy. The technique combined forensic DNA with publicly available family tree research, allowing experts to identify unknown suspects through distant relatives rather than direct matches. It demanded extraordinary patience. Analysts built enormous family histories stretching backward through generations, eliminating branches one by one until only a handful of possible individuals remained. The method had already transformed several historic investigations, proving that even killers who had never been arrested could eventually be identified if their relatives had unknowingly provided the necessary genetic connections. Barbara Tucker's case suddenly possessed something it had never truly had before: a realistic path toward an answer. Detectives reopened every document once more. Old interview transcripts were reread. Forgotten names resurfaced. Maps were unfolded again after years inside storage boxes. Investigators revisited timelines, compared travel routes, reconsidered overlooked possibilities, and prepared for the painstaking process of matching science with history. Somewhere inside tens of thousands of pages waited the missing connection capable of turning anonymous DNA into a living human being, And for the first time since Barbara disappeared, the silence surrounding her murder no longer felt permanent. It felt fragile, as though 44 years of darkness were beginning to crack under the relentless weight of truth, while a killer who had spent nearly half a century believing he had escaped justice remained completely unaware that the evidence he left behind on one violent night in California had never stopped waiting for him. By the time Barbara Tucker's murder entered its fourth decade without an arrest, the investigation had become something few detectives ever want to inherit, a case weighed down by thousands of pages of reports, fading photographs, aging evidence envelopes, and a family that had spent more years waiting for answers than Barbara herself had lived. Every box represented hundreds of hours of police work completed by investigators who had long since retired, moved away, or passed on. Some handwritten notes had yellowed with age. Audio recordings had been transferred from deteriorating cassette tapes to digital files. Evidence labels carried dates that belonged to another era. Yet despite the passage of time, one fact remained unchanged. Somewhere, a man who had taken Barbara's life was still unidentified. Cold case investigations are unlike ordinary homicide cases. Detectives cannot question a fresh witness while memories remain sharp. They cannot rush to preserve a crime scene that has only just been discovered. Instead, they work against an enemy that never stops advancing: time. Every year, memories become less reliable. Witnesses relocate, die, or simply forget details they once believed impossible to lose. Businesses' close telephone records vanish. Vehicles are scrapped. Homes are renovated. Entire neighborhoods change beyond recognition. Solving an old murder often means rebuilding a world that no longer exists. Barbara's world had disappeared decades earlier. Investigators began by reconstructing everything they could about the final known days of her life. They revisited the timeline established by detectives in 1980, comparing every documented movement with information collected over the years. They examined where she had lived, whom she knew, where she worked, and the routines that defined her daily life. Nothing was considered too insignificant. A brief conversation, a canceled appointment, an unexplained absence, a forgotten acquaintance. Cases that survive for decades are often solved because someone notices the importance of something everyone else overlooked. The challenge was enormous. California at the end of the 1970s was a state in motion. Millions of people traveled its highways every week. Interstate 5 connected major cities across hundreds of miles, carrying truck drivers, vacationers, commuters, and strangers whose paths crossed only once. For investigators, the highway represented both opportunity and frustration. It explained how a victim could be transported far from home, but it also expanded the possible crime scene to almost unimaginable proportions. Detectives asked the same difficult question repeatedly. Where had Barbara actually been killed? The roadside where her body was discovered was almost certainly not the location of the murder itself. Evidence suggested her body had been transported before being abandoned. That meant there were at least 2 locations investigators needed to identify: the place where Barbara encountered her killer and the place where the killer decided to dispose of her remains. Neither location was obvious. Without surveillance cameras, GPS records, mobile phone data, or electronic toll systems, investigators had to rely almost entirely on physical evidence and logical reconstruction. They spread maps across conference tables, tracing possible travel routes through California. They estimated driving times. They considered traffic conditions during the holiday season. Every possible route generated another series of questions. Why choose Kern County? Why travel that far? Why leave the body beside a roadway instead of hiding it more carefully? Sometimes criminal decisions reveal personality. A hurried disposal may suggest panic. A carefully selected remote location may suggest planning. An unusually long journey may indicate familiarity with a particular region or an attempt to separate victim from offender. Detectives debated every possibility. Meanwhile, forensic scientists focused on something much smaller: the preserved biological evidence. What investigators in 1980 had carefully collected using methods available at the time now entered laboratories equipped with technology those original detectives could scarcely have imagined. Machines capable of examining microscopic amounts of DNA produced genetic profiles with extraordinary precision. Analysts worked under strict contamination controls, understanding that decades-old evidence offered no second chances. The results confirmed something critically important. The biological evidence belonged to an unknown male. It was a breakthrough, but only a partial one. When the DNA profile was entered into law enforcement databases, investigators waited for the notification every detective hopes to receive. Nothing. No convicted offender matched. No immediate suspect appeared. The unknown profile remained exactly that known. For many investigations, that moment becomes another dead end. But forensic science had entered a new era. Instead of asking whether the killer had previously been arrested, investigators began asking a completely different question. What if one of his relatives had unknowingly left a genetic trail? The technique known as investigative genetic genealogy had already demonstrated remarkable success in several major cold cases. Unlike traditional DNA database searches, this approach relied on comparing crime scene DNA with profiles voluntarily submitted by individuals researching their ancestry through genealogy services that permitted law enforcement access under specific legal conditions. Even distant cousins could provide enough information to begin constructing enormous family trees. The process was painstaking. There were no dramatic computer screens instantly revealing a suspect's face. No blinking red markers announcing "match found." Instead, genealogists spent weeks and months examining birth certificates, marriage records, census information, newspaper archives, military records, obituaries, cemetery listings, and public documents stretching back through multiple generations. One distant cousin became for grandparents. For grandparents became dozens of descendants. Dozens became hundreds. Hundreds became thousands. Investigators slowly eliminated entire branches based on age, geography, and biological compatibility until only a small number of individuals remained worthy of closer examination. Patience replaced speed. Precision replaced luck. Barbara's family, meanwhile, continued living with the uncertainty that had shaped their lives for more than 40 years. Every advancement in forensic science carried renewed hope, but hope itself could become exhausting. Families of homicide victims often describe time differently than everyone else. Anniversaries are not simply dates on a calendar. They reopen wounds. Birthdays become reminders of years stolen. Every headline announcing another cold case solved forces an impossible question into their minds. Will ours be next? Many families eventually stop speaking publicly about the investigation not because they have given up, but because grief becomes private after decades of unanswered questions. The world moves on. News cycles end. Reporters stop calling. Only relatives continue counting the years. Inside police departments, however, dedicated cold case investigators understand something the public sometimes forgets. An unsolved homicide has no expiration date. Evidence waits. Technology advances. Truth survives. The renewed investigation demanded complete discipline. Detectives avoided becoming emotionally attached to any single theory. Cold cases have a dangerous tendency to encourage confirmation bias. After reviewing thousands of documents, investigators can begin seeing patterns that do not actually exist. Every conclusion required independent verification. Every assumption had to be challenged. Could Barbara have known her killer? Possibly. Could the murder have been random? Also possible. Did the transportation of her body indicate prior criminal experience? Perhaps. Nothing could be accepted without evidence. As genealogical research narrowed potential family connections, investigators began identifying men who fit critical criteria. They examined ages, locations, employment histories, travel possibilities, and known associations. Every name generated background investigations. And most were eliminated quickly. Some remained. The list gradually became shorter. Each elimination increased the pressure. Somewhere among the remaining possibilities stood a man whose DNA would either solve the case or send investigators back to the beginning. Obtaining confirmation required another carefully planned step. Investigators could not simply accuse someone based upon genealogical probability. They needed a direct DNA comparison. That meant legally collecting a fresh biological sample from the individual under investigation. Sometimes suspects voluntarily provide DNA. Sometimes detectives recover discarded items such as drinking cups, cigarette butts, or other objects abandoned in public places, allowing laboratories to compare the recovered DNA with evidence from the crime scene. The strategy had succeeded in numerous cold cases across the country. Would it succeed here? As investigators quietly prepared their next move, they worked with extraordinary secrecy. Premature disclosure could compromise the investigation. If the suspect learned he had become the focus of renewed attention, important evidence could disappear. Witnesses might be influenced. Legal challenges could emerge. The operation remained confidential. Outside the investigation, life continued normally. Neighbors greeted one another. Families celebrated birthdays. Communities carried on. Unaware that somewhere in California, detectives were preparing to confront a mystery that had survived nearly half a century. For Barbara Tucker's loved ones, the possibility of justice no longer seemed like an impossible dream whispered into silence. It was becoming something tangible, still uncertain, still fragile, but closer than it had ever been. Every laboratory report, every genealogical chart, every reviewed document brought investigators another step toward identifying the unknown man whose DNA had remained hidden in evidence storage for decades. The killer had counted on distance. He had counted on time. He had counted on fading memories. He had counted on forensic limitations that existed in 1979. What he could never have anticipated was that the smallest biological trace left behind during one violent encounter would outlive every one of those advantages, preserved through decades by detectives who refused to discard evidence, strengthened by scientific breakthroughs no one could have predicted, and carried forward by investigators who believed that even after more than 40 years, the truth could still emerge from the shadows. Somewhere ahead, that truth was waiting not as speculation, not as rumor, but as a name that would finally transform an anonymous DNA profile into the face of a man who had spent nearly half a century believing the past could never catch him. The breakthrough did not arrive with flashing lights or a dramatic late-night phone call. It came quietly, buried inside spreadsheets, family records, genetic markers, and thousands of names that meant nothing until they suddenly meant everything. Cold case investigators had learned that solving decades-old murders rarely resembled the movies. There were no miraculous confessions, no anonymous informants appearing out of nowhere. Instead, justice often emerged through relentless patience, one verified fact at a time. Every document was another piece of a puzzle scattered across generations. Every DNA comparison narrowed the search. Somewhere inside an enormous family tree, investigators believed they were getting closer to the man who had crossed paths with Barbara Tucker in the final days of 1979. Forensic genetic genealogy demanded extraordinary discipline. Analysts first identified individuals who shared portions of DNA with the unknown profile recovered from Barbara's case. None of these people were suspects. Most had never heard Barbara Tucker's name. They had simply submitted their DNA years earlier in hopes of learning more about their ancestry. What they unknowingly provided was a distant biological map. Detectives and genealogists began constructing family trees that stretched backward through great-grandparents, then forward again through children, grandchildren, cousins, marriages, and relocations. Entire generations unfolded across computer screens and historical records. At first, the possibilities seemed endless. Hundreds of relatives, thousands of descendants, families scattered across multiple states. But with each verified birth certificate, marriage license, obituary, military record, and census entry, the enormous tree became easier to navigate. Certain branches could be eliminated immediately. Some descendants were too young. Others had died long before Barbara disappeared. Many had never lived anywhere near California. Investigators crossed out names one after another, reducing overwhelming complexity into a manageable list of possibilities. The work often continued late into the night. There were no television cameras, no public announcements, no guarantee of success. Just detectives, genealogists, forensic scientists, and prosecutors working quietly toward a goal that many had once considered impossible. As the candidate list narrowed, investigators shifted from genealogy to traditional detective work. Every remaining individual underwent careful examination: employment history, residential addresses, criminal records if any existed, vehicle ownership, military service, travel patterns, family connections. Every available public document became part of the review. One name gradually began drawing closer attention, not because investigators wanted it to, because the evidence kept pointing in the same direction. The individual fit the approximate age investigators expected. His movements during the late 1970s appeared consistent with the regions relevant to Barbara's disappearance. More importantly, his place within the reconstructed family tree aligned with the unidentified DNA profile recovered from the preserved evidence. Still, experienced detectives understood an important rule. Circumstantial alignment is not proof. Only a direct DNA comparison could answer the question that had remained unresolved for more than 4 decades. Planning the next step required patience. Investigators could not risk alerting the individual prematurely. If he became aware of the investigation before authorities obtained a confirmatory DNA sample, legal complications could arise. Evidence might disappear. Potential witnesses could be contacted. Detectives therefore proceeded with absolute discretion. Surveillance became part of the operation. Without making accusations, investigators quietly observed the suspect's routine. Where did he go? Who did he meet? What opportunities existed to lawfully recover discarded biological material? Modern investigations often depend upon something remarkably ordinary: a drinking cup left in a trash bin, a napkin, a tissue, a cigarette. An object abandoned in a public place can legally become evidence, allowing forensic laboratories to compare newly collected DNA with biological material preserved from the original crime scene. The strategy had already proven successful in numerous cold cases throughout the United States. Now investigators hoped history would repeat itself. Meanwhile, Barbara Tucker's family remained largely unaware of how close the investigation had come to its most significant turning point. After so many years, law enforcement understandably revealed very little. Cold case investigations require confidentiality, especially when they approach the point of identifying a suspect. Families often receive only limited updates until investigators are confident the evidence will withstand legal scrutiny. For Barbara's loved ones, uncertainty had become routine. Decades earlier, they had searched desperately for explanations. Now they had learned to live with unanswered questions. The grief never disappeared. It simply changed shape. Children grew into adults carrying memories passed down by parents who refused to let Barbara's name be forgotten. Younger relatives knew her not through personal experience, but through family photographs, stories shared during holidays, and the painful awareness that someone had stolen a future that should have unfolded naturally. Every anniversary reminded them that justice delayed had become part of their family's identity. Across California, the criminal justice system itself had changed dramatically since Barbara's murder. DNA laboratories expanded. Cold case units received greater attention. Prosecutors became increasingly experienced in presenting forensic evidence developed decades after crimes occurred. Courts across the country accepted genetic genealogy not as proof of guilt by itself, but as an investigative tool leading detectives towards suspects whose identities were ultimately confirmed through traditional DNA analysis. That distinction remained essential. Genealogy could suggest. DNA could confirm. The law demanded confirmation. Eventually, investigators obtained the opportunity they had been waiting for. A discarded biological sample believed to belong to the man under surveillance was recovered and submitted for laboratory comparison. The evidence traveled under strict chain of custody procedures. Every transfer was documented, every seal inspected. Every analyst understood the significance of the examination. The comparison itself required no dramatic interpretation. DNA either matched or it did not. When the laboratory completed its analysis, the conclusion was unmistakable. The genetic profile recovered from the suspect matched the biological evidence preserved from Barbara Tucker's homicide. More than 40 years after the murder, investigators finally possessed what generations of detectives had pursued: a scientifically supported identification. The unknown man was no longer unknown. For the detectives working the case, the moment carried enormous emotional weight. Some had devoted years to reviewing files that many believed would never produce an answer. Others had inherited the investigation from colleagues who never lived to see the breakthrough. In homicide investigations, victories are rarely celebrated with excitement. They arrive quietly, accompanied by the knowledge that every breakthrough also confirms a terrible truth. Barbara Tucker had indeed been murdered, and the man responsible had lived freely for decades. The investigation, however, was far from over. Identifying a suspect is only one part of building a prosecutable homicide case. Investigators now had to answer another critical question. Could they prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt after more than 40 years? Witnesses had aged. Some had died. Physical locations had changed. Evidence had to be carefully re-examined to determine what remained available for trial. Detectives reopened interview files created in 1980. Every original report was scrutinized once again. Statements that once seemed insignificant suddenly acquired new meaning when viewed alongside the suspect's identity. Old investigative decisions were reconsidered. Timelines were refined. Travel routes reanalyzed. Every fact had to fit together with precision because prosecutors knew the defense would undoubtedly challenge every aspect of a decades-old investigation. Cold cases often depend not on one overwhelming piece of evidence, but on multiple independent facts reinforcing one another. DNA, victim identification, a timeline, geography, behavior, opportunity. Each element strengthens the next. As investigators assembled the final case, they remained aware that one unavoidable question would eventually arise. Why had it taken so long? The answer reflected both tragedy and progress. In 1980, the science necessary to identify the killer simply did not exist. Detectives had preserved the evidence. Future scientists had unlocked its potential. Neither group alone could have solved the case. Justice required both. The original investigators deserved recognition for collecting and safeguarding evidence with remarkable care despite having no ability to fully analyze it. The modern investigators deserved equal recognition for refusing to accept that an old murder was beyond resolution. Together, separated by more than 4 decades, they had accomplished something extraordinary. Somewhere, the suspect continued living what appeared to be an ordinary life, unaware that detectives had crossed the invisible line separating suspicion from identification. Every normal day brought him closer to a confrontation he could not anticipate. Every routine activity unfolded beneath the quiet certainty that science had already reached him, even if handcuffs had not. Barbara Tucker had entered the year 1980 as a homicide victim whose killer had no name. More than 4 decades later, that anonymity had finally collapsed. The evidence had spoken. A family tree had narrowed. The laboratory had confirmed. The mystery that once seemed destined to remain buried forever had begun transforming into something entirely different, a criminal case preparing to confront the man who believed time had erased his past, unaware that every year he spent believing he had escaped justice had only allowed science to become powerful enough to find him at last. For more than 4 decades, the man connected to Barbara Tucker's murder had lived beyond suspicion. He had awakened to ordinary mornings, gone to work, shared conversations with neighbors, celebrated holidays, and watched California transform around him. Entire generations had grown up since the winter when Barbara disappeared. New highways stretched across the state. Technology reshaped everyday life. Children born after the murder became parents themselves. Yet through every passing year, one silent witness had remained unchanged. The DNA preserved from Barbara Tucker's homicide had waited patiently inside an evidence locker, untouched by the passage of time, carrying a biological signature that could neither forget nor forgive. Once investigators obtained the direct DNA match, the pace of the investigation changed dramatically. The question was no longer whether they had identified the correct individual. The focus shifted toward building a case capable of surviving the intense scrutiny of a courtroom. Every major cold case prosecution faces the same challenge. The crime may have occurred decades earlier, but the burden of proof remains exactly the same. Prosecutors must convince a jury beyond a reasonable doubt. Age alone does not lower that standard. Detectives returned once again to every surviving piece of evidence. Photographs taken at the original recovery scene were enlarged using modern imaging technology, allowing investigators to examine details that earlier generations could barely distinguish. Reports prepared in 1980 were reviewed alongside newly developed forensic findings. Every timeline was reconstructed minute by minute. Every known movement of Barbara Tucker during the final days of her life was carefully compared against what investigators now knew about the identified suspect. Cold case investigations often resemble archaeological excavations. The truth is rarely uncovered in one dramatic discovery. Instead, investigators brush away layers of forgotten information until a complete picture gradually emerges. Some witnesses who had been interviewed decades earlier were contacted again. Time changes people in unexpected ways. Individuals once reluctant to speak may become willing after 40 years. Relationships that once demanded loyalty may have ended long ago. Fear fades. Secrets lose their purpose. Detectives understood that even if memories had weakened, certain details could suddenly become significant when viewed in light of the new forensic evidence. Every conversation mattered. Some witnesses struggled to remember names. Others could still vividly recall emotions. A strange encounter, an unusual phone call, a vehicle parked where it did not belong. Pieces that had seemed disconnected in 1980 were now examined through an entirely different lens. The suspect himself had also changed. He was no longer the younger man investigators believed had crossed paths with Barbara during the closing days of 1979. Decades had transformed his appearance. Hair had turned gray. Wrinkles had replaced youthful features. Friends and neighbors may have seen nothing extraordinary about him. To them, he was simply another older Californian living an ordinary life. But DNA ignored appearances. It ignored age. It ignored reputation. It recognized only biological truth. Before making an arrest, investigators worked closely with prosecutors to ensure every procedural requirement had been satisfied. The use of investigative genetic genealogy had already proven effective in numerous cold case investigations across the United States, but prosecutors knew the defense would likely examine every step. They reviewed search warrants, laboratory procedures, chain of custody documentation, and the methods used to obtain the suspect's confirmatory DNA sample. Everything had to be precise. Everything had to be documented. Everything had to withstand legal challenge. The detectives understood another reality unique to cold cases. An arrest after 40 years affects more than the suspect. It reaches into entire families. Children who never imagined a parent could be accused of murder suddenly confront unimaginable questions. Grandchildren discover that family history contains secrets no one suspected. Neighbors struggle to reconcile ordinary memories with horrifying allegations. Communities that believe the past was settled are forced to reconsider everything they thought they knew. Barbara Tucker's family experienced an entirely different emotional journey. For decades, they had learned to live without expectations. Hope had become dangerous. Every few years, a possible lead emerged, only to disappear once investigators reached another dead end. They had endured disappointment too many times to celebrate prematurely. Even as detectives quietly approached the point of arrest, family members remained cautious. They had spent years protecting themselves from hope because hope, when shattered repeatedly, becomes another form of grief. Yet this time felt different. Law enforcement officials were no longer discussing possibilities. They were discussing evidence, scientific evidence, evidence that could not be explained away by coincidence or fading memory. The investigation had entered territory no previous review had ever reached. Behind closed doors, prosecutors assembled the formal homicide case. They evaluated not only the DNA evidence, but the complete investigative record stretching back to 1980. Every document was organized chronologically. Witness statements were indexed. Laboratory reports were prepared for presentation. Expert witnesses who could explain modern forensic techniques to jurors were identified. The passage of time complicated every decision. Some original investigators were no longer alive to testify. Others had retired decades earlier. Fortunately, careful documentation preserved much of their work. Their reports became their voices. Every handwritten observation recorded during those early days after Barbara's body was discovered now carried renewed importance. It was a remarkable example of how meticulous police work can survive long after the investigators themselves leave the profession. Cold case detectives frequently acknowledge that they stand on the shoulders of those who came before them. Without the discipline shown by the original investigators in preserving evidence and documenting procedures, no amount of modern science could have solved Barbara's murder. The breakthrough belonged to multiple generations of law enforcement. One collected, another preserved, another analyzed. Together they built the bridge across 45 years. Meanwhile, the suspect continued living his routine, apparently unaware that investigators had reconstructed a path leading directly to him. There were no public announcements, no media speculation identifying him. Detectives intentionally maintained complete secrecy until every remaining legal step had been completed. Surveillance continued quietly. Investigators documented movements. They verified addresses. They confirmed identity through multiple independent sources. No assumption was accepted without verification. Experience had taught them that even overwhelming DNA evidence required careful investigative discipline. A successful prosecution depends upon credibility. Every action taken by investigators would eventually be examined inside a courtroom. Outside the investigation, the world remained oblivious. Traffic flowed along Interstate 5 exactly as it had for decades. Drivers passed the general area where Barbara's body had been found without realizing that one of California's oldest unsolved homicides was approaching its most significant turning point. For Barbara's relatives, every passing day unknowingly brought them closer to a moment many believed might never arrive. A homicide detective making a phone call with words they had imagined countless times. "We've identified a suspect." Those words carry enormous weight. They do not erase grief. They do not restore stolen years. They do not return the person who was lost. But they replace uncertainty with truth. For many families, truth itself becomes a form of justice. The investigation now stood at the threshold between history and accountability. For 45 years, Barbara Tucker's murder had existed primarily as an unsolved case file, revisited periodically by determined investigators who refused to let it disappear into storage forever. Now it was becoming an active homicide prosecution, a living suspect. a complete DNA identification, a carefully constructed investigative record, a family finally approaching answers. Yet detectives remained aware that one final step carried extraordinary importance: the arrest. After waiting nearly half a century, it had to be executed with absolute professionalism. No mistakes, no shortcuts, no unnecessary risks. The man who had quietly lived through decades believing the past had been buried forever was about to discover that time had not protected him at all. Instead, every passing year had strengthened the science capable of exposing him, preserved the evidence he believed had disappeared, and united generations of investigators whose determination had outlasted his confidence. The silence that had surrounded Barbara Tucker's murder since 1979 was finally ending, not with speculation or rumor, but with the unmistakable sound of justice drawing closer, one deliberate step at a time. The arrest of a murder suspect after more than 4 decades is unlike the dramatic scenes often portrayed in films. There are no frantic pursuits through crowded streets, no desperate attempts to flee across rooftops. More often, it begins with a quiet knock on a door, a calm introduction by detectives who have spent years preparing for this exact moment, and a realization that the past has finally arrived. For Barbara Tucker's killer, the ordinary routine that had defined his life for decades was about to end. The murder that had remained buried since the winter of 1979 was no longer an unsolved mystery hidden inside dusty evidence boxes. It had become an active criminal prosecution supported by modern forensic science, meticulous investigative work, and evidence that had survived nearly half a century. By the time law enforcement was ready to move, every significant detail had been reviewed repeatedly. Prosecutors and investigators understood that this was not simply another homicide arrest. It was a case that would immediately attract public attention because it represented something larger than one murder. It demonstrated how cold cases, once considered impossible to solve, could be reopened through scientific advances unimaginable when the crime occurred. Every procedural step had to withstand scrutiny. Every document had been checked. Every laboratory report had been independently verified. The detectives assigned to the operation carried more than arrest warrants. They carried 45 years of unanswered questions. They carried the expectations of a family that had lived almost half a century without justice. They carried the responsibility of every investigator who had worked the case before them. When officers approached the suspect, they did so with the professionalism demanded by any homicide investigation. Age had changed the man they confronted. He was no longer the individual investigators believed had encountered Barbara Tucker during those final days of 1979. Time had altered his appearance, slowed his movements, and added decades to his face. Yet beneath those visible changes remained the same DNA profile preserved from the crime scene all those years earlier. His science had reached across generations. The biological evidence had waited patiently while the suspect grew older. Now the two finally met. As detectives informed him that he was being arrested in connection with Barbara Tucker's murder, one question lingered in the minds of everyone involved. Had he ever believed this day would come? Only he knew the answer. Many offenders who escape immediate detection gradually convince themselves they will never face consequences. Each passing year strengthens that belief. 5 years become 10, 10 become 20, 20 become 40. Witnesses disappear, investigators retire, families age, public attention fades, the crime becomes history. Until suddenly it doesn't. The arrest represented the moment when history became the present again. News traveled quickly. Although investigators carefully controlled the release of information during the active phase of the case, an arrest in a decades-old homicide inevitably generated widespread attention. Local news organizations reported that one of California's long-unsolved murders had finally produced a suspect through advances in DNA technology. The story spread beyond Kern County and San Diego. Across the country, people who followed developments in forensic science recognized another example of investigative genetic genealogy transforming what once seemed impossible into reality. For Barbara Tucker's family, however, the headlines meant something entirely different. The news was deeply personal. For 45 years, they had lived without answers. Now they finally had a name connected to Barbara's death. No press conference could fully capture the emotional complexity of that moment. Relief existed alongside grief. Satisfaction coexisted with sorrow. Justice arriving after decades still arrived too late to restore birthdays, family gatherings, conversations, or futures that had been stolen. An arrest does not erase loss. It simply confirms that the loss mattered. Investigators, meanwhile, entered another demanding phase of the case. Preparing for court. Many people assume DNA alone automatically guarantees conviction. Experienced prosecutors know otherwise. Scientific evidence must be explained clearly to jurors unfamiliar with forensic genetics. Laboratory procedures must be documented in detail. Expert witnesses must describe how DNA was preserved, tested, compared, and confirmed. Every link in the chain of custody must demonstrate that evidence remained secure from the moment investigators collected it in 1980 until modern laboratories completed their analysis decades later. Defense attorneys, as expected, examined every aspect of the investigation. They reviewed procedural decisions, laboratory methods, evidence preservation, witness recollections, timeline reconstruction. Such challenges are routine within the justice system and reflect its commitment to ensuring that every criminal conviction rests upon reliable evidence rather than assumption. Cold case prosecutions often require extraordinary preparation because jurors naturally ask an important question. If why now? The answer lay inside the evolution of forensic science. In 1980, investigators had preserved biological evidence with remarkable care despite lacking the technology necessary to fully analyze it. Decades later, DNA profiling matured. Then genetic genealogy expanded investigative possibilities even further. The combination of careful evidence preservation and scientific innovation finally produced the identification investigators had pursued for nearly half a century. During the legal proceedings, prosecutors emphasized that the investigation itself had never truly stopped. It had simply entered periods where available technology could carry it no further. Detectives reviewed the file repeatedly over the years, waiting for advances capable of extracting additional information from preserved evidence. Barbara Tucker's murder remained open because law enforcement refused to declare it forgotten. That distinction mattered. A cold case is not an abandoned case. It is a case waiting for opportunity. Barbara's investigation had finally found that opportunity. The broader law enforcement community also watched closely. Every successful cold case prosecution strengthens confidence in preserving evidence, investing in forensic laboratories, and supporting specialized investigative units. Detectives across the United States understood that Barbara Tucker's case reinforced a simple but powerful lesson. Evidence collected today may solve a crime decades from now. No investigator can predict which tiny biological sample will someday become the key to justice. The original detectives who processed Barbara's case in 1980 almost certainly never imagined DNA technology capable of identifying an unknown offender through distant relatives. Yet they preserved the evidence anyway. That decision changed everything. As public attention grew, many people reflected upon how dramatically homicide investigations had evolved since Barbara disappeared. In the late 1970s, investigators relied heavily upon eyewitness testimony, fingerprints, blood typing, and traditional detective work. Those methods remained valuable, but they had limitations. Modern forensic genetics introduced an entirely new investigative dimension. Cases once dependent upon luck increasingly depended upon science. Still, science alone never solved Barbara's murder. People did. The detectives who refused to close the file. The evidence technicians who preserved biological samples. The forensic scientists who developed increasingly advanced testing methods. The genealogists who painstakingly reconstructed generations of family history. The prosecutors who assembled the legal case. Justice emerged because hundreds of individuals, separated by decades, contributed pieces to the same investigation. Barbara Tucker herself never lived to witness any of it. That reality remained the deepest tragedy of all. She entered the final days of 1979 expecting an ordinary future. Instead, her life ended violently, leaving loved ones to carry unanswered questions for 45 years. Nothing inside a courtroom could restore the life she should have lived. Nothing could return the opportunities stolen from her. The legal process could establish responsibility. It could not reverse history. Yet accountability matters. It tells families that their loved one's life has not been forgotten. It tells communities that even decades later, homicide remains a priority. And it tells offenders that time itself is no longer the shield it once appeared to be. As prosecutors finalized their presentation, Barbara Tucker's name once again entered public conversation, not merely as another unsolved homicide from California's past, but as a powerful reminder that justice sometimes moves slowly, almost imperceptibly, until one scientific breakthrough transforms decades of silence into undeniable truth. The investigation that had begun beside a lonely stretch of roadway in Kern County during the winter of 1980 had survived changing technologies, retiring detectives, fading memories, and the relentless passage of time. Now at last, it stood before the justice system with the one thing it had lacked for nearly half a century: the identity of the man investigators believed had ended Barbara Tucker's life, proving that while killers may escape detection for years, they can never outrun the evidence they leave behind. The courtroom was not filled with the urgency that had defined the investigation for more than 4 decades. There were no flashing police lights, no crime scene tape fluttering in the wind, no frantic detectives racing against the clock. Instead, there was silence, the kind of silence that settles over a room when every person understands they are witnessing history. The murder of Barbara Tucker had crossed generations. Detectives who first opened the case in 1980 had grown old. Some were no longer alive. New investigators now sat only a few feet away from evidence they had spent years studying, evidence collected before many of them had even been born. The distance between the crime and the courtroom measured more than 40 years, but the responsibility remained exactly the same: to prove, beyond a reasonable doubt, that justice delayed had not become justice denied. For Barbara Tucker's family, entering the courthouse carried an emotional weight few could understand. Every hallway, every courtroom bench, every document presented before the judge represented a future they had waited decades to see. The years had not erased grief. They had simply buried it beneath routine. Birthdays had passed. Parents had aged. Brothers, sisters, nieces, nephews, and friends had built lives while carrying an invisible absence that never truly disappeared. Some family members who had once searched desperately for Barbara were no longer alive to witness the legal proceedings. They had died without ever hearing the name of the person investigators believed had taken her life. Justice, when it finally arrived too late for many. Yet it arrived nonetheless. The prosecution began constructing the timeline with extraordinary care. Unlike fresh homicide cases, where jurors can hear testimony from recent witnesses and examine newly collected evidence, this case depended upon connecting two worlds separated by 45 years. Prosecutors explained who Barbara Tucker was before she became a victim. She was not simply another name inside a police report. She was a daughter, a sister, a woman with plans, relationships, responsibilities, and a future abruptly stolen. Photographs showed a smiling face untouched by the violence that would soon define public memory. That contrast mattered. Cold case prosecutions are about restoring identity to victims whose lives risk being reduced to evidence, numbers, and forensic terminology. Barbara had lived long before she became part of an investigation. The jury then learned how investigators found her body beside the isolated roadway in Kern County. Crime scene photographs, carefully handled because of their disturbing nature, documented the lonely location where someone had attempted to abandon both a victim and the truth. Detectives described the methods used to secure the scene, collect evidence, and preserve biological material. Every witness emphasized one crucial point: the evidence had remained protected. From 1980 until modern DNA testing decades later, the chain of custody had never been broken. That continuity formed the backbone of the prosecution's forensic case. Expert witnesses explained the evolution of DNA science in language ordinary jurors could understand. They described how biological evidence collected during the original investigation could not be fully analyzed using the technology available in 1980. Instead of criticizing those limitations, they emphasized how investigators had anticipated future scientific advances by preserving every available sample with exceptional care. It was an investment in a future no one could predict. The jury listened as forensic scientists explained DNA profiling, genetic markers, laboratory quality controls, contamination prevention, statistical probability, and comparison procedures. Unlike television dramas, real forensic testimony is methodical, technical, and deliberately cautious. Scientists avoid dramatic conclusions. They present measurable facts. The biological profile recovered from preserved evidence matched the DNA obtained from the defendant. The result was independently confirmed. Quality assurance standards had been followed. Laboratory procedures had been documented. The science spoke with remarkable consistency. Next came testimony regarding investigative genetic genealogy. Because many jurors had never encountered the technique before, prosecutors carefully distinguished between genealogy and direct forensic identification. Experts explained that genealogy served only as an investigative lead, narrowing the field of possible individuals through family relationships. It did not determine guilt. Once investigators identified a likely suspect, they obtained a separate DNA sample and performed a traditional forensic comparison. That comparison, not genealogy, linked the defendant to the biological evidence recovered from Barbara Tucker's murder. The distinction proved important. The courtroom was not being asked to trust experimental science. It was being asked to evaluate established forensic DNA analysis supported by a documented investigative process. The defense, meanwhile, challenged the prosecution's presentation wherever possible. That is the role of the adversarial legal system. Defense attorneys questioned the passage of time. They examined witness memories. They scrutinized laboratory procedures. They explored whether decades-old evidence could remain reliable. As such arguments were expected. Every serious homicide prosecution undergoes rigorous testing inside the courtroom because the consequences of conviction are profound. The prosecution responded by returning repeatedly to one fundamental principle: time affects memory. It does not alter DNA. A biological profile preserved correctly remains scientifically reliable regardless of how many years have passed. That principle had transformed countless cold case investigations across the United States. Barbara Tucker's murder now stood among them. Outside the courthouse, public interest continued growing. Journalists reported on the remarkable journey from an unsolved 1979 homicide to a modern DNA prosecution. For many observers, the case symbolized the extraordinary progress achieved by forensic science. Families of victims in other unsolved cases watched carefully, wondering whether preserved evidence in their own loved one's investigation might someday produce similar answers. Cold case detectives across the country followed developments as well. Each successful prosecution reinforced the importance of preserving evidence indefinitely. What seems scientifically impossible today may become routine tomorrow. Barbara's investigation illustrated that lesson perfectly. Back in 1980, no one could have imagined identifying an unknown suspect through distant relatives and advanced genetic analysis. Yet the original detectives had preserved the evidence anyway. Their discipline became the foundation of the entire prosecution. During recesses, Barbara Tucker's family quietly reflected on the extraordinary path that had brought them to this point. They remembered years when no investigator had called with updates because there had been nothing new to report. They remembered anniversaries marked only by unanswered questions. They remembered hoping that one day someone, somewhere, would discover the truth. Now they sat only a few feet away from the man accused of taking Barbara's life. No courtroom could erase decades of loss, but it could finally replace uncertainty with accountability. The emotional contrast inside the courtroom was impossible to ignore. On one side sat a family whose lives had been permanently altered by violence. On the other sat the individual prosecutors alleged was responsible. Between them stood science. Not emotion, not speculation, not rumor. Science. Every exhibit introduced into evidence represented another piece of a puzzle assembled across generations. Original police reports, crime scene photographs, laboratory analyses, DNA comparisons, witness testimony. Together, they told a story stretching from a lonely California roadside in the winter of 1980 to a modern courtroom where technological advances finally allowed investigators to identify the person they believed had escaped justice for nearly half a century. As proceedings continued, one truth became increasingly clear. Barbara Tucker's murder was no longer defined by mystery. For decades, the case had been known primarily for what investigators did not know. Now it was increasingly defined by what they had proven. The transformation had required extraordinary patience, scientific innovation, and unwavering commitment from multiple generations of investigators. It had demanded that evidence survive longer than memories, that determination outlast frustration, and that technology eventually catch up with a killer who believed history had buried his crime forever. Inside that courtroom, 45 years after Barbara Tucker lost her life, every witness, every forensic report, and every carefully preserved piece of evidence served the same purpose: to ensure that the silence surrounding her murder would never again belong to the person accused of causing it, but instead to the enduring strength of truth finally emerging from the shadows where it had waited for almost half a century. As the trial moved deeper into the evidence, the atmosphere inside the courtroom became increasingly intense. The initial shock surrounding the arrest had given way to something more deliberate, more methodical. Every day added another layer to a case that had survived longer than many criminal careers. Jurors were no longer hearing the story of a mysterious homicide from another era. They were watching decades of investigative work unfold before them, piece by piece, until the once fragmented picture began to resemble a complete narrative. There was no dramatic confession, no eyewitness suddenly identifying the killer after 45 years. Instead, there was something arguably more powerful evidence that had remained silent for decades until science finally gave it a voice. The prosecution carefully reminded the jury that time itself had once protected violent offenders in ways that are difficult to imagine today. In the late 1970s, detectives relied heavily on fingerprints, blood typing, eyewitness testimony, and physical surveillance. Those methods solved countless crimes, but they also had limitations. If an offender left no fingerprints, if witnesses saw little or nothing, if physical evidence could not be connected to a known suspect, investigations often stalled. The killer did not have to destroy every trace of evidence. He simply had to survive long enough for available technology to reach its limits. Barbara Tucker's murderer had done exactly that. For years, it appeared to have worked. The investigation slowed. The headlines disappeared. The case entered storage. Yet the evidence never truly became cold. It simply waited. One forensic expert after another explained how biological material, when properly preserved, remains one of the most reliable forms of evidence in criminal investigations. DNA does not become less unique with age. It does not change its identity because decades have passed. As long as contamination is prevented and preservation standards are maintained, The profile recovered from evidence remains scientifically valid. That simple principle had transformed Barbara Tucker's case. The defense questioned laboratory procedures in detail, exploring every opportunity to raise reasonable doubt. Experts were asked about testing methods, statistical probabilities, contamination safeguards, and documentation. These exchanges were highly technical, sometimes lasting hours. Jurors listened carefully as scientists explained every stage of the analytical process. No shortcuts had been taken. Every critical finding had been independently reviewed. The DNA profile recovered from the preserved evidence remained consistent throughout repeated examinations. The comparison with the defendant's DNA produced the same conclusion. Scientific certainty does not emerge from one test alone. It emerges through repetition, verification, and strict adherence to established protocols. That was precisely what investigators had done. The prosecution then turned to the broader investigation, demonstrating how traditional detective work complemented the forensic evidence. DNA had identified the suspect, but detectives had not stopped there. They revisited decades-old records, confirmed timelines, examined historical movements, and verified information through independent sources. Every significant conclusion rested upon multiple supporting facts. This combination of old-fashioned investigative persistence and modern scientific capability represented the true strength of the case. Technology alone had not solved Barbara Tucker's murder. Neither had detective work alone. Justice became possible only because both evolved together. The jury also heard about the extraordinary care taken by the original investigators in 1980. Evidence technicians described the procedures used to collect biological samples, preserve clothing, document the crime scene, and maintain chain of custody records. The passage of time had not erased their professionalism. In many ways, those first investigators had unknowingly prepared the case for a future they would never see. Their work became a silent partnership with detectives who would inherit the investigation decades later. Cold case specialists often speak about this invisible collaboration. One generation collects, another preserves, a third finally solves. Barbara Tucker's case embodied that philosophy perfectly. Meanwhile, outside the courtroom, the public conversation surrounding the case continued growing. Newspapers, television stations, and online publications discussed not only Barbara's murder, but the broader implications for cold case investigations across the country. Families with loved ones in unsolved homicide cases paid close attention. Some contacted police departments to ask whether preserved evidence in their own cases could be re-examined. Others reached out to advocacy organizations supporting victims' families. Barbara Tucker's case became something larger than a single prosecution. It became evidence that even the oldest investigations could still move forward. For retired detectives who had once worked the case, the trial carried profound emotional significance. Some followed the proceedings from home. Others attended portions of the hearings when possible. Many reflected upon the frustration they had experienced decades earlier when every available lead had reached a dead end. They remembered interviewing witnesses whose memories were still fresh, searching landscapes that have since changed completely, and carefully preserving evidence despite having no certainty that future technology would ever unlock its secrets. Now, years after leaving active service, they watched that decision reshape the investigation. Their work had mattered, perhaps not immediately, but ultimately. For Barbara Tucker's family, every day inside the courtroom reopened memories that had never fully healed. Photographs, testimony, and forensic evidence forced them to revisit events they had spent years trying to survive. Yet alongside the pain existed something unfamiliar. Answers. Not every question had been resolved. Some details surrounding Barbara's final hours would likely remain unknown forever. Only two people truly knew everything that happened: Barbara and the person accused of killing her. One of them could no longer speak. The other now faced the justice system. That imbalance exists in nearly every homicide case. Investigators reconstruct events through evidence because victims are denied the opportunity to tell their own stories. The prosecution sought to ensure that Barbara's story would nevertheless be heard. As testimony continued, prosecutors emphasized another critical point. The cold case investigations require extraordinary perseverance. Unlike active homicide cases, they rarely benefit from momentum. Detectives often spend months reviewing material that produces no immediate results. Entire weeks may pass without discovering a single useful lead. Success depends upon persistence rather than speed. Barbara Tucker's investigation demonstrated exactly that. 45 years. Multiple generations of detectives. Repeated reviews. Scientific breakthroughs. Countless hours spent examining evidence that many people believed had already revealed everything it could. Yet hidden within that preserved material remained the identity of the man investigators eventually identified. The defense, naturally, reminded jurors that the crime had occurred decades earlier and encouraged them to consider the challenges created by the passage of time. Witness memories fade. Physical locations change. Records disappear. Such realities are undeniable. But prosecutors responded with equal clarity. Those challenges explained why solving the case had taken decades. They did not diminish the reliability of the DNA evidence that finally identified the suspect. The distinction became central to the trial. Time complicated the investigation. It did not invalidate the science. Each day of testimony brought the courtroom closer to its final phase. Expert witnesses completed their analyses. Detectives described investigative decisions. Laboratory specialists explained genetic comparisons. The enormous puzzle assembled over 4.5 decades gradually reached completion. For Barbara Tucker's family, the experience remained deeply emotional. They understood that no verdict could restore the years stolen from them. No sentence could return Barbara to family gatherings, celebrations, or ordinary moments that should have unfolded naturally. Justice cannot reverse murder. It can only acknowledge responsibility. Yet that acknowledgement carries enormous importance. Without it, violence leaves not only grief, but permanent uncertainty. Barbara Tucker's case was finally escaping that uncertainty. The truth had traveled an extraordinarily long road from a remote California roadside in the winter of 1980 through decades of unanswered questions, scientific revolutions, forgotten evidence boxes, retired detectives, and relentless cold case investigators into a courtroom where facts, rather than speculation, now define the narrative. Every witness who stepped down from the stand left behind another piece of certainty, another reminder that while memory may weaken and time may obscure details, evidence preserved with care possesses a remarkable ability to endure. It had endured long enough to identify a suspect, long enough to rebuild an investigation once thought impossible to solve, and long enough to ensure that Barbara Tucker's name would no longer be remembered only as part of an unsolved mystery, but as the center of a case that proved justice can remain patient for decades without ever surrendering its pursuit of the truth. As the trial approached its final stages, the weight of 45 years settled over every person inside the courtroom. The evidence had been presented. The scientific testimony had been heard. Detectives from different generations had explained how a single investigation survived changing technologies, changing personnel, and changing times. What had begun as an unexplained homicide in the winter of 1979 had become one of California's most remarkable examples of perseverance in modern criminal investigation. Yet beyond the courtroom, another story unfolded quietly, a story about memory, loss, and the extraordinary resilience of those who had refused to let Barbara Tucker disappear from history. For Barbara's family, justice had never been measured only by arrests or courtroom proceedings. It had been measured in the countless ordinary moments that should have included her but never would. Every family gathering carried an invisible absence. Holiday celebrations left one chair permanently empty. Weddings, birthdays, anniversaries, and the birth of new generations all unfolded against the knowledge that Barbara should have been there to witness them. time did not lessen that absence. It simply forced those who loved her to learn how to live beside it. Many people imagine that grief fades. Families of homicide victims often describe something different. Grief changes. It matures. It settles into everyday life. It becomes quieter, but never truly leaves. Barbara's relatives had carried that burden through changing decades. They had watched television reports announcing breakthroughs in other cold cases and wondered whether their own family would ever receive the same phone call. Sometimes hope felt unbearable. Every new forensic development revived expectations that could easily end in disappointment. Every review of the investigation raised familiar questions before returning to silence. This time, silence had finally been broken. The broader law enforcement community recognized the significance of the case far beyond Barbara Tucker's murder itself. Cold case detectives across the country understood that every successful prosecution sends a message not only to victims, families, but also to offenders who believe they have escaped accountability. Time is no longer a reliable hiding place. Scientific progress has fundamentally changed that reality. In previous generations, a murderer who avoided detection during the first critical months after a crime often believed the greatest danger had passed. Physical evidence might degrade. Witnesses would move away. Investigators would retire. Records could disappear. The longer someone remained unidentified, the more secure they often felt. Modern forensic science reversed that assumption. Evidence preserved properly can become more valuable with age rather than less. Every advancement in DNA technology creates new opportunities to re-examine old investigations. Barbara Tucker's case demonstrated that transformation with remarkable clarity. The prosecution emphasized this point during closing arguments, reminding jurors that the investigation had not succeeded because of luck. It succeeded because generations of investigators refused to abandon the evidence. They continued asking questions long after public attention had faded. They preserved biological material that scientists decades later could finally analyze with extraordinary precision. Justice required patience. And not coincidence. The defense urged jurors to consider the enormous passage of time between the crime and the prosecution. They argued that memories fade, circumstances change, and reconstructing events after 45 years presents undeniable challenges. Such arguments reflected realities present in every cold case prosecution. Prosecutors returned repeatedly to the evidence. Physical evidence, scientific evidence, evidence that existed independently of human memory. The DNA recovered from Barbara Tucker's homicide had remained unchanged despite the passage of decades. The science did not depend upon recollections shaped by time. It depended upon biological facts preserved since the original investigation. Throughout the proceedings, one theme continued emerging: the remarkable foresight of the original investigators. Back in 1980, evidence technicians carefully collected and preserved biological samples without knowing whether future technology would ever unlock their significance. They followed procedure because procedure mattered. They protected evidence because professionalism demanded it. That commitment ultimately became the cornerstone of the entire prosecution. Many retired detectives later reflected upon the emotional impact of seeing the case finally move toward resolution. Some remembered Barbara Tucker's investigation vividly despite the decades that had passed. Others admitted they had feared the case would remain unsolved forever. Homicide investigators rarely forget the victims whose killers escape identification. Those names remain part of their professional lives long after retirement. Barbara Tucker was one of those names. Now, after nearly half a century, the investigation had finally reached a courtroom. Families connected to other unsolved homicide cases also followed developments closely. Advocacy organizations supporting victims' relatives pointed to Barbara's case as powerful evidence that preserving evidence and funding cold case investigations can produce extraordinary results. Police agencies throughout the country renewed efforts to inventory unsolved homicides containing biological evidence suitable for advanced DNA analysis. Barbara Tucker's case inspired hope far beyond California. It reminded countless families that unsolved does not necessarily mean unsolvable. Yet, experienced investigators cautioned against unrealistic expectations. Not every cold case contains recoverable biological evidence. Not every preserved sample produces usable DNA. Not every investigation benefits from circumstances allowing genetic genealogy. Barbara Tucker's murder represented a convergence of careful evidence preservation, advancing technology, and persistent investigative work. Success required all three. Inside the courtroom, Barbara herself remained the quiet center of every proceeding. Although decades had passed since her death, prosecutors consistently reminded jurors that this case concerned far more than forensic science. It concerned a woman whose life ended violently before she reached 30 years old. She had dreams, relationships, plans, a future. Those realities could easily become overshadowed by discussions of DNA profiles and investigative techniques. The prosecution refused to let that happen. Barbara Tucker was not simply evidence. She was the reason the investigation existed. As the legal process moved toward its conclusion, detectives who had devoted years to the case reflected privately upon the extraordinary journey that had brought them there. They remembered reading interview notes prepared by investigators they had never met. They remembered wondering whether any meaningful breakthrough remained possible. Now they knew the answer. Persistence had prevailed. The investigation also reinforced another lesson deeply respected within homicide units. No case should be closed merely because available technology has reached its limit. Technology changes. Evidence remains. The detectives who originally investigated Barbara Tucker's murder could not perform modern DNA analysis. They could, however, preserve the evidence that future scientists would eventually examine. That single decision echoed across 45 years. The few professional choices carry such lasting consequences. As closing arguments approached, the courtroom atmosphere grew increasingly solemn. Everyone present understood that whatever verdict ultimately emerged, the proceedings represented the end of one extraordinary chapter in California's criminal justice history. Barbara Tucker's murder had challenged investigators for nearly half a century. Now the justice system prepared to reach its conclusion. For Barbara's family, the experience remained bittersweet. They had finally received answers. But those answers arrived decades after the crime itself. Justice had survived. Time had not. The years stolen by uncertainty could never be returned. Still, accountability carries its own profound significance. It affirms that victims are remembered. It affirms that evidence matters. It affirms that determination can outlast even the longest silence. Barbara Tucker's name would no longer exist only within lists of unsolved California homicides. Her case had become something larger, a testament to scientific progress, meticulous investigative work, and the unwavering belief that every victim deserves the truth, regardless of how many years have passed. As the courtroom prepared for its final arguments, the journey that began beside a lonely stretch of highway decades earlier stood as a reminder that while killers may rely upon fading memories and passing time, justice possesses a remarkable ability to wait patiently, preserving its strength through generations until the moment finally arrives when silence gives way to truth. When the attorneys rose to deliver their closing arguments, the courtroom fell into a silence that seemed almost tangible. Every witness had spoken. Every forensic report had been introduced. Every photograph, every laboratory finding, every carefully preserved piece of evidence had been examined under the unforgiving light of legal scrutiny. There was nothing left to investigate inside that room. The task now belonged to the jury. But before 12 strangers withdrew to deliberate, the prosecution and the defense offered two very different interpretations of the same extraordinary journey, a journey that had stretched from the final days of 1979 to a courtroom more than 4 decades later. The prosecution began by reminding jurors that the case was not built upon a single dramatic moment. It was built upon persistence. Persistence from the detectives who processed the crime scene. Persistence from the evidence technicians who preserved biological material, persistence from the forensic scientists who revisited the evidence decades later, persistence from the cold case investigators who refused to let Barbara Tucker's name disappear into forgotten archives. The prosecutors spoke not about mystery, but about continuity. Every generation had carried the investigation a little farther. Every advancement in science had revealed another piece of the truth. The jury was asked to look beyond the extraordinary passage of time and focus on the evidence itself. Time had changed hairstyles. It had changed technology. It had changed California. What it had not changed the biological evidence collected during the original investigation. And DNA did not age. It did not forget. It remained exactly what it had always been, a silent witness preserved for 45 years. The prosecution carefully explained that investigative genetic genealogy had never been presented as proof of guilt. Instead, it served only as the investigative pathway that allowed detectives to identify an individual worthy of closer examination. The decisive evidence came later, when investigators obtained a direct DNA sample from the suspect and laboratory analysts confirmed that it matched the biological material preserved from Barbara Tucker's homicide. That distinction remained central. The investigation had followed the evidence, not assumptions, not speculation, evidence. The defense responded by emphasizing the unique challenges created by the passage of decades. Witnesses naturally forget details. Physical locations change. Some individuals involved in the original investigation were no longer alive to testify. Memories become uncertain after 45 years. Those observations were undeniably true. Time complicates every cold case prosecution. The defense urged jurors to examine every element carefully, reminding them that the burden of proof rested entirely with the prosecution. The courtroom listened attentively. The legal process demanded nothing less. For Barbara Tucker's family, however, the arguments represented something much more personal than legal strategy. They had lived through every year separating the crime from the courtroom. They knew exactly what 45 years meant. 45 Christmas mornings, 45 birthdays, 45 anniversaries marked not by celebration, but by remembrance. Every year had deepened the absence left by Barbara's murder. Every unanswered question had become another chapter in their family's history. Now strangers held the responsibility of evaluating evidence that had shaped nearly half a century of their lives. Outside the courthouse, journalists continued reporting on the extraordinary nature of the investigation. National attention focused not only on Barbara Tucker's murder, but also on the broader significance of DNA technology in modern criminal justice. Experts discussed how investigative genetic genealogy had fundamentally changed the landscape of cold case investigations. Yet many emphasized an important point. Technology alone cannot solve crimes. Evidence must exist. It must be preserved. Investigators must remain willing to revisit old cases despite years of frustration. Barbara Tucker's investigation illustrated that every one of those conditions had been met. Across the country, homicide detectives quietly reviewed their own unsolved cases with renewed determination. Evidence rooms containing decades-old biological samples suddenly seemed filled with new possibilities. Cases once considered dormant were re-examined through the lens of advancing forensic science. Barbara Tucker's case became part of a growing movement, a reminder that justice evolves alongside technology. For retired investigators who had participated in the original inquiry, the trial offered something they had almost stopped expecting: closure. Not personal closure. Investigators rarely experience homicide cases that way. Instead, professional closure. The knowledge that years of careful work had ultimately mattered. That preserving evidence had not been an exercise in false hope. That the countless hours spent documenting a crime scene in 1980 had helped create an opportunity for justice decades later. Some reflected upon younger detectives who had inherited the investigation. They recognized that no single individual had solved Barbara Tucker's murder. The case belonged to generations. Each investigator carried it forward until science finally reached the point where answers became possible. That continuity represented one of the most remarkable aspects of the investigation. Law enforcement careers begin and end. Evidence remains. The jury eventually retired to deliberate. Inside the deliberation room, there were no cameras, no reporters, and no spectators. Only evidence. Jurors reviewed testimony, forensic findings, and legal instructions provided by the court. Their responsibility was not to satisfy public opinion or emotional expectation. Their responsibility was to evaluate whether the prosecution had established guilt beyond a reasonable doubt using the evidence presented during trial. While deliberations continued, Barbara Tucker's family waited. Waiting had become painfully familiar. They had waited during the search after her disappearance. They had waited through decades of unanswered questions. They had waited through scientific breakthroughs that initially produced no identification. Now they waited once again. But this time the waiting felt different. It no longer centered upon discovering the truth. It centered upon determining legal accountability. The distinction mattered profoundly. For years, uncertainty had been the defining feature of Barbara Tucker's murder. Now certainty had emerged through science. The justice system's role was to determine what consequences should follow. Cold case investigators understand better than almost anyone that delayed justice carries complicated emotions. Families often describe relief mixed with sorrow. Detectives experience satisfaction tempered by the knowledge that the victim never lived to witness the outcome. Communities celebrate scientific progress while remembering the violence that made such progress necessary. Barbara Tucker's case reflected all of those realities. It was simultaneously a story of tragedy and perseverance, of violence and scientific innovation, of grief and determination. As the jury considered its verdict, the significance of the case extended far beyond one courtroom. It demonstrated the extraordinary value of preserving evidence indefinitely. It highlighted the importance of funding forensic laboratories and specialized cold case units. It reinforced public confidence that even decades-old homicides deserve continued attention. Most importantly, it reminded families everywhere that time does not automatically erase the possibility of justice. Sometimes it merely postpones it. The lonely stretch of California roadway where Barbara Tucker's body had been discovered all those years earlier remained physically unchanged in many respects. Vehicles still passed along Interstate 5 every day. Travelers hurried toward destinations without realizing they were crossing the landscape of one of California's longest-running homicide investigations. The landscape had witnessed silence. Now it had witnessed truth. Whether the verdict ultimately confirmed the prosecution's case or not, one fact could no longer be disputed. Barbara Tucker's murder had not been forgotten. It had survived the passage of 45 years because generations of investigators refused to abandon it, because evidence technicians protected fragile biological material with exceptional care, because forensic scientists continued pushing the boundaries of what was scientifically possible, and because one family never stopped believing that somewhere beyond the silence, the truth still existed. That truth had traveled further than anyone could have imagined in 1980, crossing decades of uncertainty before arriving inside a courtroom where 12 jurors now carried the final responsibility of deciding whether the extraordinary journey from an unidentified DNA profile to an accused killer had reached the legal certainty required for justice at last. The verdict represented the end of a legal proceeding, but it could never represent the end of Barbara Tucker's story. Long before a jury entered the courtroom, long before prosecutors organized decades of evidence into exhibits and timelines, Barbara had lived an ordinary life filled with the same expectations shared by millions of people. She had plans that were never fulfilled, conversations that were never finished, and years that were stolen in a single act of violence. The criminal case had finally answered one of the most important questions who investigators believed was responsible, but it could never answer every question surrounding those final moments. Like many homicide investigations, certain details would remain known only to the victim and the person accused of taking her life. When the courtroom proceedings concluded, Barbara's family experienced emotions that often seem contradictory to those who have never lived through a decades-long homicide investigation. There was relief. There was sadness. There was exhaustion. There was gratitude toward the investigators who had refused to surrender. And there was an unmistakable awareness that justice, no matter how determined, can never restore lost time. 45 years cannot be returned. Parents grow older. Children become grandparents. Entire lifetimes unfold while an investigation quietly waits for science to catch up with the evidence. For Barbara's relatives, the legal outcome did not erase those years. Instead, it replaced uncertainty with certainty. For decades, every family gathering had carried the same unanswered question: who did this? Now that question finally had an answer supported by modern forensic science and one of the most extensive cold case investigations in California's history. The detectives who helped solve the case also found themselves reflecting upon the unusual nature of their work. Unlike investigators assigned to fresh homicide scenes, cold case detectives often build relationships not with living victims, but with history itself. They spend countless hours reading reports written by officers they have never met. They reconstruct crime scenes that no longer exist. They learn the habits, routines, and final movements of victims whose lives ended before many of the investigators themselves were born. Barbara Tucker became one of those victims. Through photographs, interview transcripts, evidence logs, laboratory reports, she became more than a case number. She became a responsibility inherited across generations. Many detectives have described cold case work as a promise made on behalf of those who can no longer speak. The promise is simple. As long as evidence remains, the investigation continues. Barbara Tucker's case demonstrated the extraordinary power of that philosophy. The original investigators had preserved biological evidence because professional standards required it. They could not have predicted the emergence of advanced DNA profiling, much less investigative genetic genealogy. Yet their commitment to proper evidence collection became the foundation upon which future generations ultimately built the case. It was a remarkable partnership across time. One generation collected, another preserved, another solved. The investigation also reinforced an important lesson regarding public confidence in the criminal justice system. Families often fear that unsolved murders eventually become forgotten. Evidence rooms fill with boxes. Personnel retire. Budgets change. New crimes demand immediate attention. It becomes easy to believe that older investigations quietly disappear. Barbara Tucker's case proved otherwise. An unsolved homicide may become inactive for periods. It does not cease to matter. Advances in forensic science have fundamentally changed how law enforcement approaches preserved evidence. Every improvement in DNA technology creates another opportunity to revisit investigations that once appeared impossible to solve. Biological samples previously considered too small or too degraded can sometimes produce meaningful results using modern analytical techniques. Barbara's case stood as compelling evidence of that reality. Throughout California and across the United States, law enforcement agencies continued reviewing other unsolved murders containing preserved biological evidence. Detectives examined storage facilities holding clothing, fingernail scrapings, hair samples, and countless other items collected decades earlier. Every preserved sample represented possibility. Every evidence box carried hope. Not every case would produce an answer, but some would. Barbara Tucker's investigation encouraged agencies to continue trying. For forensic scientists, the case highlighted another essential principle. Scientific progress depends not only upon innovation, but also upon preservation. The most advanced laboratory in the world cannot analyze evidence that no longer exists. Evidence discarded decades earlier cannot benefit from future discoveries. The painstaking efforts of crime scene technicians in 1980 ensured that Barbara Tucker's homicide remained scientifically solvable long after contemporary investigative methods had reached their limits. That foresight became one of the investigation's greatest strengths. Investigative genetic genealogy also continued attracting national attention following Barbara's case. Experts consistently emphasized that the technique serves as an investigative lead rather than direct courtroom evidence. It helps detectives identify individuals for further investigation. Traditional forensic DNA comparison remains the scientific foundation supporting criminal prosecutions. Barbara Tucker's investigation followed exactly that model. Genealogy identified a potential suspect. Direct DNA analysis confirmed the biological match. Traditional detective work verified the surrounding facts. Together, they created a legally supportable case. Families connected to other unsolved homicides frequently cited Barbara's story when advocating for continued funding of cold case units. They understood that solving decades-old murders requires patience, specialized expertise, and financial investment. Laboratories require resources. Genealogical research requires time. Detectives require support. Justice rarely happens by accident. Barbara Tucker's case became a powerful argument for maintaining those commitments. Yet despite the extraordinary investigative success, one truth remained impossible to escape. Barbara herself never came home. No courtroom victory could change that. No forensic breakthrough could restore the future she lost. Justice acknowledged what happened. It could not undo it. That reality serves as a sobering reminder that homicide investigations ultimately exist not because science is fascinating or detective work is compelling, but because a human life was violently taken. Everything else follows from that tragedy. For younger investigators entering homicide units, Barbara Tucker's case quickly became an educational example demonstrating the importance of patience, documentation, and evidence preservation. Training programs increasingly referenced successful cold case investigations to illustrate how seemingly insignificant decisions at a crime scene may determine whether justice becomes possible decades later. Collect everything. Document everything. Preserve everything. The future may depend upon it. That philosophy echoed through law enforcement academies, forensic laboratories, and investigative conferences long after Barbara Tucker's case entered history. The lonely roadside where her body had been discovered remained physically unchanged by the legal proceedings. Travelers continued passing through Kern County without realizing that the landscape beside the highway had once concealed one of California's longest-running homicide mysteries. Nature had reclaimed much of the surrounding terrain. Seasons continued changing exactly as they had every year since 1980. Only the meaning of that place had changed. For decades, it symbolized unanswered questions. Now it symbolized perseverance. Barbara Tucker's story became far more than the account of a murder finally investigated through modern science. It became evidence that determination can survive across generations, that carefully preserved evidence can outlast fading memories, and that justice possesses a remarkable ability to adapt alongside scientific discovery. The investigation reminded the nation that violent crimes do not disappear simply because calendars continue turning. Sometimes they wait patiently inside forgotten evidence lockers until technology becomes powerful enough to reveal what investigators could never have seen before. In Barbara Tucker's case, that patient pursuit transformed 45 years of silence into one of California's most significant cold case resolutions, ensuring that her name would forever be remembered not only for the tragedy that ended her life, but also for the extraordinary perseverance that finally uncovered the truth hidden within the smallest traces of evidence she left behind. Long after the headlines began to fade, Barbara Tucker's case continued to echo through police departments, forensic laboratories, and the families of victims who were still waiting for answers. The arrest and prosecution marked the end of one investigation, but they also became the beginning of countless others. Detectives across the United States looked at their own shelves filled with aging homicide files and asked the same question that had transformed Barbara's case. What if the evidence is still waiting? Inside evidence vaults from California to New York, from Washington state to Florida, thousands of sealed boxes held fragments of forgotten crime scenes. Plastic envelopes containing hairs collected under fingernails, clothing carefully packaged decades earlier, swabs taken from victims when forensic DNA technology barely existed. Handwritten labels had faded with age. Cardboard boxes had gathered dust. Some of the detectives who sealed them had long since retired, while others had passed away without ever knowing whether the evidence they preserved would matter. Barbara Tucker's case answered that question with remarkable clarity. It mattered. Perhaps not immediately, perhaps not for decades, but eventually it mattered more than anyone could have imagined. Cold case investigators often describe evidence as something that never grows tired. Witnesses forget. Detectives retire. Suspects age. Communities change. But evidence, when preserved correctly, remains patient. It asks for nothing. It simply waits until someone possesses the tools to understand what it has been saying all along. That lesson reshaped how many agencies viewed unsolved murders. Cases that had once been considered exhausted were suddenly reclassified as promising candidates for renewed forensic review. Police departments expanded cold case units. Prosecutors developed specialized teams experienced in presenting decades-old evidence before modern juries. Laboratories invested in increasingly sensitive DNA analysis capable of producing usable genetic profiles from samples once considered too limited for examination. Barbara Tucker's murder had become part of that national transformation. The investigation also highlighted the extraordinary value of collaboration. Solving a 45-year-old homicide required expertise from multiple disciplines working together toward a common goal. Crime scene technicians, forensic biologists, DNA analysts, investigative genealogists, cold case detectives, prosecutors. Each contributed something essential. No single profession solved the case alone. That collaborative model soon became the standard for many complex cold case investigations throughout the country. For Barbara's family, however, the broader impact of the case remained secondary to something much more personal: memory. For years, Barbara had existed primarily within family conversations and fading photographs. Younger relatives knew her through stories told by parents and grandparents. They learned about the sister, daughter, aunt, and friend whose future had been stolen before many of them were even born. The legal proceedings changed something profound. Barbara was no longer remembered only as someone who disappeared into an unsolved mystery. She became remembered as someone whose name finally received justice. That distinction carried enormous emotional significance. Families of homicide victims often speak about a second loss that occurs when investigations remain unsolved for decades. Over time, public attention fades. Newspapers stop printing anniversaries. Television stations move on. The victim risks becoming known only as another statistic. Barbara Tucker escaped that fate. Not because 45 years erased the tragedy, but because 45 years of determination eventually restored her story. Investigators also reflected upon another uncomfortable truth. The man identified through DNA had lived freely for decades while Barbara's family endured uncertainty. During those years, he experienced ordinary milestones that Barbara never could. He grew older. He watched technology change. He saw new generations emerge. He lived through historical events that Barbara never witnessed. The imbalance was impossible to ignore. Cold case detectives understand this reality better than anyone. Every year an unsolved murder remains unresolved is another year the victim's family carries a burden the offender does not. Barbara Tucker's investigation finally corrected that imbalance, even if only partially. Justice delayed remains justice. But delay always carries a cost. The case also became a powerful educational tool within forensic science programs. Universities teaching criminal justice and forensic biology frequently discussed investigations like Barbara's to illustrate the practical importance of evidence, preservation, and scientific integrity. Students learned that breakthroughs rarely occur because of dramatic discoveries. They occur because professionals consistently follow procedure. Every properly labeled envelope, every documented chain of custody, every contamination control measure, every carefully preserved sample. These ordinary acts of professionalism ultimately make extraordinary results possible. Barbara Tucker's investigation embodied that principle perfectly. The original evidence technicians could not predict DNA sequencing technologies that would emerge decades later. They simply did their jobs correctly. Future investigators inherited the benefits of that professionalism. As more agencies embraced investigative genetic genealogy, experts repeatedly emphasized ethical safeguards accompanying the technique. Public trust depended upon transparency, legal oversight, and appropriate use of genetic information. Barbara Tucker's case demonstrated how genealogy functions as an investigative pathway rather than a substitute for traditional forensic confirmation. That distinction protected both scientific credibility and constitutional fairness. Modern investigations increasingly balanced technological innovation with legal accountability. Barbara's case helped illustrate that balance. Communities also responded differently to cold case resolutions than they had in previous decades. Instead of viewing these investigations merely as historical curiosities, many people began recognizing them